It was supposed to be just another interview, a calm afternoon conversation with one of cinema's oldest living legends. Yet when Al Pacino, now 84, leaned forward and said softly, "Johnny was the son I never had," the world seemed to pause for a heartbeat. The sentence, uttered with the tired grace of an old lion, broke through decades of silence. Cameras froze. The journalist blinked, unsure if he had misheard. But Pacino's eyes, still dark and burning beneath their heavy lids, told the truth. This wasn't a line rehearsed for publicity. It was a confession, half whispered, half relieved, the kind of truth that escapes only when a man is too old to fear judgment. The air in the room thickened with memory. The name Donnie Brasco surfaced, like a ghost from 1997, when a younger Johnny Depp walked beside Pacino through the shadows of New York's criminal underworld, a film about loyalty, betrayal, and love between two men who could never say the word. On screen, they were a doomed duo, the weary mentor and the beautiful student, one losing his faith, the other losing himself. Off screen, something similar had taken shape. Depp had always spoken of missing a father figure, of growing up among absences and noise. Pacino, for all his fame, had lived like a monk of cinema, devoted to his craft, yet perpetually alone. The film brought them together, but the silence between takes built something else, an invisible lineage. Now, nearly 3 decades later, Pacino's words reopened a chapter no one knew existed. It was not gossip. It was gratitude. The confession of a man who had spent his life speaking through characters, finally admitting that one of them had become real. As the interview ended, Pacino's voice trembled. "He reminded me that tenderness is not weakness," he murmured. "Maybe that's what a father should teach." Outside, the rain tapped the windows like an old metronome, counting the seconds between 2 generations. Was it only a role that bound them, the dying gangster and the young infiltrator? Or had the screen become the only place where love between men like them could survive? Long before Al Pacino's trembling confession, their story began on a humid New York morning in 1996. The set of Donnie Brasco buzzed with nervous energy. Pacino, already a legend whose name echoed through cinematic history, walked onto the soundstage like a man returning to his kingdom. Johnny Depp, 33 and restless, stood quietly in the corner, observing him as though studying a sacred text. Hollywood at that time was a paradox of power and vulnerability. Pacino had conquered it decades earlier: The Godfather, Serpico, Scarface. He had nothing left to prove. His face alone carried the mythology of masculinity, that mix of moral exhaustion and explosive grace. Depp, meanwhile, was the new enigma, beautiful, unpredictable, hiding behind odd characters and silent gazes. He wanted to disappear into every role he played, yet something in him longed to be seen. When director Mike Newell first introduced them, Pacino extended his hand with the wary politeness of an old craftsman. "You're good," he said after their first rehearsal, pausing just long enough to make it sound like a challenge. Depp smiled faintly. It was all he needed. On screen, they were destined for tragedy. Lefty, the aging hitman clinging to dignity; Donnie, the undercover agent betraying the man who had come to love him. But what unfolded behind the camera was more subtle, a transmission of something wordless, a bridge between generations of artists. During those long nights of filming, Pacino would sit in his chair, cigarette smoke curling around his profile, watching Depp with a quiet fascination. "He listens," Pacino later told a friend. "He doesn't act, he listens. Most don't." It was the kind of praise Pacino rarely gave, the kind that meant a bond was forming beyond technique. To the public, Donnie Brasco was just another gangster film. Yet within the Hollywood machinery, everyone felt it carried a strange intimacy. There was tenderness between the two men, the kind that flickers briefly between those who understand loneliness too well. Depp, whose father had left when he was 15, gravitated toward older men who embodied stability. He had once said of Marlon Brando, he was chaos and comfort at the same time. With Pacino, it was something quieter, not rebellion, but refuge. The contrast between them fascinated the crew. Pacino, precise and deliberate, spoke through pauses. Depp, ethereal and shy, spoke through silence. Sometimes they barely exchanged words for hours. Yet when the camera rolled, the space between them vibrated with authenticity. One of the assistant directors recalled, you could feel them breathing the same rhythm. It wasn't performance anymore. It was communion. As the film progressed, the boundary between fiction and reality began to blur. Depp found himself calling Pacino Lefty, even off set. Pacino, in turn, started treating Depp like a son, correcting his gestures, sharing stories of failure, exhaustion, art. Once, during a late-night shoot, Pacino told him, acting is not pretending. It's remembering the pain, the joy, everything you lost. Depp nodded, his eyes glistening. That night, he called his sister and said, I finally met someone who understands why I do this. The illusion of mentorship became real. They were no longer just characters in a mafia tragedy, but two men mirroring each other's need for connection. For Pacino, the industry had long been a lonely altar. Fame had given him everything except continuity, no heir, no legacy beyond his films. In Depp, he sensed the possibility of someone who would carry the torch not through imitation, but through essence. And yet, Hollywood was not kind to such tenderness. The press celebrated their chemistry, but never saw the vulnerability behind it. Award season came and went. Donnie Brasco earned nominations. Applause. Headlines. Both men walked the red carpet side by side. Faces composed. Smiles practiced. To the cameras, they were actors promoting a film. Only in fleeting glances, the brief hand on a shoulder. The knowing smile did the truth shimmer through. As the years unfolded, their lives took opposite turns. Pacino, aging gracefully into solitude, kept his distance from the chaos of fame. Depp, meanwhile, became its captive, the rebel heart of Hollywood, adored and misunderstood. Yet, beneath the noise, he carried Pacino's voice like a compass. In interviews, he called him a master, the gentlest soul, the man who taught me to breathe on screen. But the industry's constant noise drowned those words before they could echo. For a long time, Pacino remained silent. He watched from afar as Depp's career rose, imploded, and resurrected. He refused to comment, as if protecting something sacred. But those who knew him said he always spoke of Depp with a mixture of pride and sadness, the kind of affection a father feels for a child who has lost his way. The illusion was complete, two men bound by a film that outlasted its moment. The world saw Donnie Brasco as a story of betrayal. They never knew it was also a story of inheritance. Behind the applause, a silent lesson was taking place, one that had nothing to do with acting, and everything to do with love disguised as mentorship. There are bonds the world never names, yet they shape entire lives. Between Johnny Depp and Al Pacino, that bond existed in the invisible space between words, in the way one man sought permission to exist, and the other, forgiveness for what he had missed. After Donnie Brasco, the two men rarely shared the screen again. But the connection endured like an unspoken current. They sent letters, short and cryptic, the kind artists exchange when language feels too small. When Depp was on set for Sleepy Hollow, a note arrived in Pacino's unmistakable scrawl, "Remember the stillness. It's where truth hides." Depp kept it folded in his wallet for years. He would later say in an interview, "Al didn't teach me how to act. He taught me how to stay human in a business that eats you alive." Those words, quiet and almost embarrassed, revealed more than any headline ever could. Because behind the eccentric costumes, behind the tattoos and scandals, Johnny Depp had always been a boy searching for approval. Pacino became the mirror where he saw the man he could become, or the one he was afraid to be. Pacino understood that hunger, his own youth had been a landscape of absence, a father who vanished early, a mother who struggled alone, a childhood built on the sound of doors closing. Acting had become his substitute for belonging. "Every character was someone I loved and lost," he once admitted. When he met Depp, he recognized the same orphaned energy, a man building himself out of fragments. On set, their silence had been their deepest conversation. Between takes, Depp would sit near Pacino without speaking. Pacino, lost in thought, would occasionally glance over and nod, a gesture small enough to be missed, yet enough to say, "I see you." To be seen by Al Pacino was no trivial thing. It meant being measured by someone who had looked into the abyss of fame and come back wounded but wise. Years passed. Depp drifted from one eccentric role to another, from Edward Scissorhands to Jack Sparrow, always hiding behind invention. Each new character was a disguise for the boy who still needed his teacher's gaze. Pacino, watching from the quiet of his New York apartment, saw the transformation with a mix of admiration and worry. "He's chasing ghosts." He told a friend, "I know that feeling. You think you're creating art, but sometimes you're just running from yourself." Their paths crossed again at a film festival in the early 2000s. Depp, now the star Pacino once was, walked onto the stage to present him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. The crowd roared, cameras flashed. But when their eyes met, time collapsed. Depp's voice trembled slightly as he said, "For me, Al Pacino wasn't just an influence. He was a map." Pacino smiled a thin, proud, almost paternal smile and whispered as they embraced, "You made it, kid." That night, alone in his hotel room, Pacino reportedly wept, not out of sentimentality, but because he realized how rare it was to witness your own legacy walking on two legs. For a man who had spent his life pretending to be fathers, Michael Corleone, Frank Serpico, Lefty Ruggiero, it was humbling to find himself becoming one for real. Meanwhile, Depp's life grew noisier. Fame turned toxic. Tabloids fed on his chaos. During the storms that followed, Pacino stayed silent, refusing interviews about him. But those who saw them backstage at small events noticed the quiet gestures, a hand on Depp's shoulder, a nod of reassurance, a private moment where no words were needed. When the rest of the world saw scandal, Pacino saw pain and perhaps a reflection of his own. What few knew was that during Depp's lowest years, he would often revisit Donnie Brasco alone, watching the final scene where Lefty walks into the unknown, betrayed yet dignified. He once told a friend, "That was Al teaching me how to fall with grace." It wasn't a metaphor. In that final walk, Depp saw his own future, the inevitability of loss, the beauty of still standing. Pacino, too, faced the loneliness of age. His body slowed, his circle shrank, and the spotlight, once blinding, began to dim. He filled his days with theater and memories, speaking less, observing more. In one interview, when asked about mentorship, he paused a long time before answering. You don't choose who you pass things to. It just happens. You see someone, and you recognize yourself or the part of you that still wants to live. In that recognition lay the hidden truth. What united them was not fame, not art, but loneliness. The kind that fame only deepens. Pacino had spent his life surrounded by applause, yet untouched by intimacy. Depp, adored by millions, could not find a place to rest. Together, they had found a temporary home in each other's silence. Their friendship never demanded attention. It existed in the quiet margins, a phone call on birthdays, a shared dinner without cameras, the occasional gift of a book annotated in Pacino's careful handwriting. When Depp faced public humiliation years later, Pacino was one of the few who called. The message was brief. Remember what I told you, stillness? That word had become their secret language. Stillness was not absence. It was presence without noise. It was how they survived a world that mistook vulnerability for weakness. There was something almost sacred in the symmetry of their lives. Both born to struggling mothers. Both raised by cinema rather than family. Both addicted to transformation. Yet where Pacino had turned his solitude into discipline, Depp had turned it into disguise. One sculpted himself through control, the other through escape. Their bond, therefore, was not about similarity, but about completion. Each carried what the other lacked. In the end, the teacher and the student had become two mirrors, facing each other, infinite reflections of longing and gratitude. Neither could say the words out loud, but the truth was written in every gesture, every glance that passed between them when they thought no one was looking. And when Pacino, decades later, finally called Depp the son I never had, it wasn't a revelation. It was the closing of a circle, the public acknowledgement of a secret both men had carried in silence. Because sometimes, the deepest relationships are not defined by blood or time, but by the simple, human relief of being understood. That was the hidden truth between them, not a scandal, not a secret, but something far rarer in Hollywood, love that asked for nothing, except to be felt. In the end, the revelation did not arrive through headlines or grand gestures. It slipped quietly from Al Pacino's mouth in a late-night interview filmed under soft studio light. The journalist had asked a simple question, "Do you ever think about legacy?" Pacino hesitated. His gaze drifted beyond the camera, as if searching through decades of faces and lines, of films and ghosts. Then, with a small, almost weary smile, he said, "Legacy is not what people remember. It's who remembers you." He paused, then added, "For me, that's Johnny." There was no laughter, no attempt to dramatize. It was said with the stillness of a confession long carried. And in that moment, the myth dissolved, the legend of Al Pacino folded into something fragile and profoundly human. The man who had embodied countless fathers, gangsters, saviors, and sinners finally admitted what those roles had been hiding, the need to love and to pass something on before time runs out. For years, Pacino had resisted the sentimentality that Hollywood often demanded of its aging icons. But something in his voice that night felt different, stripped of performance. He spoke of watching Depp become the artist he had once hoped to be. He doesn't imitate. He disappears. That's bravery. Across the world, Johnny Depp was filming in Europe when the interview aired. A journalist showed him the clip on her phone. Depp watched in silence, his expression unreadable. When it ended, he blinked several times, then looked away. "He never says things like that," he murmured, almost to himself. "That means everything." Later that evening, Depp wrote a short message and sent it through Pacino's assistant. It read only, "You were right about stillness." Pacino, upon receiving it, smiled faintly and whispered, he finally understood. The revelation, therefore, was not a single moment, but a quiet convergence, two men at opposite ends of life, bound by the recognition that they had already given each other what they were searching for. Pacino had found a son not through blood, but through art. Depp had found a father not through protection, but through truth. Hollywood, of course, barely noticed. Awards, scandals, and new faces consumed the news cycle. Yet, in the private history of cinema, their relationship stood as a rare testament to what artistry can birth: emotional lineage. The torch that passes not through fame, but through empathy. In the decades separating them, both had been haunted by similar fears of irrelevance, misunderstanding, and the slow erosion of self that comes with celebrity. But through each other, they had learned endurance. Pacino's stoic restraint taught Depp that silence could be strength. Depp's sensitivity reminded Pacino that gentleness was not weakness. Together, they created a kind of emotional grammar, a way of existing that defied the industry's brutality. When Pacino later spoke at a tribute for Depp, he recited an old line from Donnie Brasco, "You think you're doing the right thing, but the right thing always costs you something." He paused and looked toward Depp in the audience. "It's true in life too," he said softly. The crowd applauded without understanding the private language behind the words. After the ceremony, they met backstage for a brief embrace. No cameras, no witnesses, just two men standing quietly, both aware that time was now the only thing neither could protect the other from. For Pacino, the revelation was acceptance, the realization that his greatest performance had not been on film, but in the mentorship that shaped another man's life. For Depp, it was redemption, the understanding that even in his most fractured years, he had carried the best of Pacino with him. The father he never had been there all along, not in lessons or advice, but in the calm presence of someone who believed he could be more. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle of recognition, when one soul finally mirrors another and says, without needing to speak, "You are enough." That, above all, was the revelation. Not the confession of an old actor or the gratitude of his student, but the sacred, wordless exchange between two human beings who, for a moment, made each other whole. In the silence that follows applause, truth often whispers the loudest. For Al Pacino and Johnny Depp, the truth was not about fame, scandal, or legend. It was about inheritance, the invisible kind that passes from one soul to another. When Pacino called Depp the son I never had, it was not nostalgia. It was acknowledgement, the quiet realization that we all search for someone to carry a piece of us forward. In that exchange between master and disciple, art became bloodline. Both men had spent their lives building masks, Pacino's carved from discipline, Depp's from imagination. Yet behind them, each was simply trying to understand what it means to be seen, to be loved without condition. Their relationship, stripped of glamour, revealed something profoundly human, that creation, at its core, is an act of love disguised as work. Pacino's legacy, then, was never the awards or the immortal roles. It was the patience to guide someone lost. And Depp's redemption was not in vindication, but in remembrance, the ability to say, even silently, he made me better. In an industry built on performance, they found authenticity. In a world obsessed with youth, they discovered the beauty of continuity, that every generation of artists is a bridge, not a replacement. The film that once united them, Donnie Brasco, was not merely about betrayal. It was about loyalty to truth, to craft, to each other. Perhaps that is the quiet moral of their intertwined lives. Fatherhood and artistry are not measured by possession, but by transmission. The things we love most are never ours to keep. We only hold them long enough to pass them on. And so, in the fading light of his long career, Pacino could finally rest, knowing that somewhere, across the ocean of time and noise, the boy he once taught to find stillness had learned to stand on his own. Because in the end, legacy is not about being remembered by millions. It is about being remembered deeply by one